Sexuality is something that what a person is attracted to. A male attracted to a female for romantic and sexual reasons is called as a heterosexual, or is called as a sexuality. Whom does one like to have sex with? Remember, there is male and female sex, there is male and female gender, but there is no male and female sexuality.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of AskHowAbout. I'm your host, Pranay J. Reddy. Today's topic, sexuality. Not gender, not sex. Sexuality. What is sexuality? I mean, it's a pretty simple definition. It's just what one person's sexual preference is, or if a person is sexually active, and what he or she chooses to like. Pretty simple, right? Or is it? As an exercise, I really do encourage you all to go and ask your family members, what is sexuality? Uncle, what is sexuality? Auntie? Because trust me, it's awkwardness 101 when you bring up sexuality in a family conversation. Pretty easy to understand why it's awkward. But when in fact it really should not be, because it's completely natural. Sexuality is something which one person desires or rather prefers to be. And it's not something which you can confine one person to become. Now, there's this common drill which says that heterosexual men and women are the only way to be. Yes, they are the majority, but other sexualities are natural as well. And I personally believe this lack of awareness that other sexualities are natural is one of the reasons why they are not widely accepted by your uncles and aunties. So again, I encourage you to bring this topic up. Please do ask them, what is sexuality in a random conversation? And please do share your comments on that. I would love to hear your stories on that. In fact, we all would. Now, the premise of this episode is simple. Scientifically, it's proven that sexuality is not just a choice, it's genetic. So in this episode, we will take a deep dive into understanding how sexuality is not just something a person grows up into becoming, but is already a part of his genetics when he or she is born. So that is why it's important to understand the developmental biology of that person. And so it's good to take a look at that field of developmental biology and how that influences, or rather that is used in studying one person's sexuality. Sexuality as a topic is big and there are a lot of stuff to cover under it. So that is why we decided to make it into a two-part. The first episode will cover the developmental aspect of it and how genetics do influence our sexuality. In the second episode, we focus on the brain chemistry and the exact nitty-gritties of how the proteins and genetics affect a human being's sexuality. So to do all that, we need an expert in genetics and an expert in developmental biology. So we interviewed Dr. Deepak Modi. He is a geneticist and a developmental biologist in ICMR NIRRH. His research areas include understanding the fundamental mechanisms of embryo implantation and early placentation, determining the molecular basis of gonad development and cell-fate decision making within them. Also, understanding biological basis of sexuality and gender. He is also a TEDx speaker. He got his doctorate in applied biology in Mumbai University. He has 55 publications. He has numerous awards, including the Innovative Young Biotechnologist Award. Now that's a bit about our guest. Let's get on with the show. Dr. Deepak Modi, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad you took out the time to come and talk with us. Well, how are you, sir? How are you doing?
Thank you so much for the invite, Pranay, and I'm doing very well. And I hope everything is good at your end.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking. It really is. I mean, it's at the end of the lockdown, so we're almost like, oh yeah, the virus is nothing.
The virus has not gone yet.
Yeah. Someone has to call and inform the virus. I think that's the problem. But we have so much to uncover today. I mean, this topic is, let's say, it should be known, but a lot of people don't know about it. But before we get into how genetics determines sexuality, just the field, developmental biology, why don't you talk a bit about that? Like an intro for us to get context on it. What is that field?
Yeah, sure. So, developmental biology is a very old field where it was more about studying of embryos, how the embryos are made, how the patterns are made, how the brain is made, how the hands are made, so on and so forth. And classically, it was essentially processes by which animals and plants grow, how they fertilize, how they grow, how their body systems are laid. And it is also about studying regeneration, reproduction, metamorphosis, and growth and differentiation of stem cells to adult organisms. So from the classical developmental biology field where people were just studying early embryos, it has now changed a lot with the newer technologies being available. We are now applying modern technologies to understand how these tissues are made, how these tissues are regenerated. Then somewhere in the last decade, we also learned what are stem cells and how these stem cells make tissues grow. So from what was left to the frogs and the worms and the drosophilas or the flies, we have now to come a full circle where we are also learning to understand how humans are developed. And all this is now possible to do in a lab dish. So it's become a very, very exciting field and it has a lot of potential.
So I'm glad you used that word potential, because now everybody's looking at what the potential is, what the scope is. So from here on, how do you think the field's future looks? Like, what is the scope of the field?
Yeah, definitely. We have come a long way in developmental biology, but now there are very, very, very new and exciting things happening in the field of developmental biology. For example, stem cells, as I told you, that have a huge regenerative potential. That means that if somebody's lost a limb or somebody has to get a liver removed because of some injury, instead of now transplant, waiting for another liver to come, we could easily isolate cells from the blood, coax them to become stem cells, and from those we can make a liver and the person can have a liver of his own. So this is now, it's going to be possible soon, although we are not yet there, but we can do that, and that's the latest happening in this direction. Also now there's something what we are calling as organoids. But in the last 5 years, the field of organoids has come into picture, where we are not just making cells in the lab dish, but we are also making mini organs in the lab. So for example, in my lab, we are understanding how the pregnancy is initiated, how the embryo sticks onto the endometrium and the placenta is made. Now this placenta is a very interesting organ. It is an organ which communicates between the mother and the baby. And we are trying to understand how this placenta is made. But now we are actually using our knowledge of that making of placenta to now make a placenta in a lab dish. We are making mini organoids or a mini placenta in a lab, or placenta on a chip. How that's going to help? We can now study that what drugs are safe in pregnancy, because when women are pregnant, they cannot be given all kinds of drugs. And today our testing of drugs is exclusively based on animal models. We treat animals with drugs, but that animals are not humans. We cannot test it on humans. So now if many organs are available, we can check which drugs are good or bad for the placenta, which drugs can go from the mother to baby, which drugs don't. And now we can screen this very, very effectively in a lab dish. We can also check if coronavirus, so we have very recently shown that coronavirus can infect the mother and even go to the baby. How does it go to the baby? Can we block it? So if we have organoids at our disposal, we can study these mechanisms in details and move ahead. So the developmental biology field from very classical basic science has come to a lot of applied value, and soon in cancer at least, it's going to move from what we call it as bench to bedside. It's already come in the clinics where patients' tumors are taken, many organoids of the tumors are made, and patient-specific drugs are being discovered so that they can be treated more effectively. So this is what the potential of the developmental biology field is, and in the next 10 years, it's going to expand extensively.
So there's huge scope and potential. That's great to hear for anybody or any viewers, like part of this life sciences or part of the biology field. And for everybody else, well, science fiction is going to become science. So look out for that.
Absolutely, I mean, absolutely, any day. So, for example, when several years ago, we never thought that we could have babies made in the lab dish. Now, millions and millions of infertile couples have benefited and have had babies. The entire field of assisted reproduction, or IVF, what we call, is thanks to our classical understanding of development biology, that now we can make embryos in the dish, give it back to the couple, and they go home with lovely babies. So it's benefited. It has transformed the way we are looking at medicine these days.
That's beautiful. So from what I took away from that is it's basically studying of cells, early cells, developing cells. And so one very well-known fact is it's an animal cell, we can determine its sexuality or not sexuality. We can determine its gender based on the X and Y chromosomes, right? But now the studies say that, in fact, part of your study, which you've been very much involved in, says that sexuality can be determined by genetics. Now, I actually have a story about this. A friend of mine, I just spoke to her recently. She told me, yeah, sexuality is determined by genetics. I was like, wait a minute, how did you know? Like, I thought that was not true. I thought sexuality was a choice. And she was like, yeah, that's actually true, but people don't actually know about it. So I want to ask you, like, how is this even possible?
Sure. So before we actually get to genetics and sexuality, let's define some terms. So you
Yeah.
realize that you have been using these terminologies very interchangeably. So there is sex, gender, and sexuality. So let's define what are the differences between sex, gender, and sexuality. Sex is something that is biologic. By that, what we mean is that what is the individual's gonads or external appearance that it is born with. So if somebody is born with testicle and as a penis, we would define it as a male sex. If an individual is born with ovaries or has tubes and breast, then we define that person as a female sex. Okay, and this sex, that is male and female sex, are defined by genetics. The chromosomes, the XX and the XY chromosomes. So all males are XYs, all females are XX. So that is all about sex. Now, when we move to gender, gender is not something that you have to look down upon and see whether you are male or a female. It is what you think about. It's not that one fine morning, everyday morning, you have to really look down and see, oh, I'm a male today. You know you are a male. How do you know you are a male? Because there's something in your brain that tells you that you are a male, right?
Okay.
So what does a person think like is the gender.
Okay.
So often the sex and the gender are congruent. But in instances, somebody may be of a male sex, but thinks by the brain that there is a female. So this is what we would call it as transsexual or transgender.
Okay.
Okay, so you have cisgendered individuals where the external genitalia or the sex and the way the person is thinking is matching is called as a cisgendered individual. And somebody whose external genitalia and the way that they think, like for example, a woman trapped in a man's body or a man trapped in a woman's body is what is a loose terminology which we use that. And these individuals are called as transgendered individuals. Okay, so sex and gender are now two different things. Third comes is sexuality. Sexuality is something that what a person is attracted to. A male attracted to a female for romantic and sexual reasons is called as a heterosexual or is called as a sexuality. Whom does one like to have sex with? A male attracted to the person of the same sex, that is a male, is called as homosexual.
Right.
A female attracted to a female is also homosexual. So males are gays and females are lesbian. So this is how we would classify. Remember, there is male and female sex, there is male and female gender, but there is no male and female sexuality. Sexuality has a whole spectrum. In fact, science today tells us that there are probably more than 40 kinds of sexualities. There could be somebody who's completely...
What?
There could be somebody completely asexual. That means a person is not attracted to anybody, does not have sexual interest. Somebody could be demisexual, that they're interested sexually only to individuals under certain conditions, which could be a romantic relationship, which could be just because a person is intellectual, so the person is sexually attracted. So it's a whole spectrum. So I hope I'm able to convey that sex, gender, and sexuality are three different things.
Yeah, definitely. But this is a lot, like 40 different sexualities as a human being. I mean, and to think, or rather, that how ignorant of us to think that all of this is just by choice. And that is why I wanted to talk to you, because you're the best person to elaborate on that. So if you can elaborate on.
Absolutely. I mean, you rightly picked it up that it's very hard to imagine that all these 40 types are just out of choice. And you don't
Yeah.
decide one fine morning that, oh, today I feel like having sex with a male or today I feel like having sex with a female. One is inherently programmed. See, remember, the problem is that in most individuals, that is 90% of the individuals, all the three are congruent. That is, that the sex, the gender, and the sexuality are congruent. But in 10% of individuals, the sex and the gender need not be congruent. That is, that a person may be of a male sex but may think like a female. In another subset of individuals, the sex and the gender may be the congruent, but the sexuality is not congruent. Now, the question is, how is this determined? So there are various theories about how is sexuality determined, how is gender determined, and how is sex determined. So sex, it is very clear that it is defined by genes. So in my lab, we have been looking at what decides the gonads, what decides the sex of the gonads, and we are trying to study that. But how does this definition of sex translate to gender and sexuality is still a gray area. Current theory suggests that most of it is a social construct. By that means that it is either a choice or how socially the person is exposed to is a determinant of that. For example, most people think that if a boy is exposed to a lot of girl-like games or exposed to more girl-like situations or has a early life sexual assault from another male, then the person would be a homosexual. This is something which has a lot of basis to it, but I kind of differ from it. I look at it that even the brain has to wire it that way. Remember, the way we think is how things are wired in the brain. If I'm allowed to share a slide, I'll show you what I mean by brain wiring and how possibly sexuality can be determined by genes as well. So I'll share my screen here. So let us understand how first sex is determined. So we have been taught in schools that all females are XX and all males are XY. But when we are developing, when we all were in our mother's wombs, whether you are XX or XY, the gonads are what we call it as bipotential. By that, what I mean that the gonad can either form a testis or an ovary. And this decision is taken by the genes present on the Y chromosome, X chromosome, or some other chromosomes. And in my lab, we are trying to figure out what are these genetic signals which make the ovary or the testis. So here is what we see, that this particular gene, what I'm highlighting here, the SRY gene, which is there, is the one which tells the gonads that, okay, you become a testis. Once a person develops a testis, the person becomes a boy. So it's not just SRY gene, but your SOX9 genes, your AMH genes, and so on and so forth, which then the gonad becomes into testis and the person is becoming like a boy. Conversely, if there are genes like Wnt4, R-spontin, LHX genes, which we are looking in my lab, the bipotential gonad goes on this pathway and it becomes the ovary. Then the ovary makes the right kind of hormones to make the individual into a girl. So this is what we call it as sex determination, the ability of the gonad to form the testis or the ovary. Now let me switch to the next slide. And we had no reason to believe that the brain does not undergo such a kind of priming. So in my lab, we hypothesized that the brain also perhaps is sex neutral, and we asked the question whether the brain also can decide its own sex. So in my lab, we have shown earlier that SOX9, LHX9, LHX2, their amounts are different between the XX and the XY gonads. So we did these experiments for a very particular reason. We thought that let's challenge the hypothesis that there's a social construct to sexuality, or there's a social construct to determining that whether the male or the female's brains are determined by a social context, but they're genetically programmed. So we took mice as our study system because in the mice, it is nice that they don't treat their males and female babies differently. And here we took now brains of mice. So we applied our knowledge of developmental biology. We took the brains of this mice and we tried and see that are there any genetic differences in the expression of these sex determining genes in the brain. And lo and behold, you look at the graph about, the pink bar are for the XX brains and the blue bar are for the XY brains. And you look at these panel of genes, LHX9, LHX2, and
Yeah, yeah.
RINT4.
So,
They are more in the female brain or the XX brain as compared to the XY brain. And look at this ESR1. It is only made by the female brains, but not by the male brains. This was exciting. This was unprecedented. And imagine, and remember, this is at the time when these mouse babies are in the womb still. They have not even made the testis or the ovaries. They're still making the testis or the ovaries, and at the brain at that same time, the brain is also getting wired differently. So now
can
what
I
we
stop you right?
propose,
Can I interject for a minute here? I wanted to know, like, are all
sure.
present in the X in the sex chromosomes, or where are they present?
No. Interestingly, none of these are present on the sex chromosome. They're
Oh,
present, in fact, on the autosomes, or what we call it as a non-sex chromosomes. They're not on the X and the Y chromosomes. They're different chromosomes there.
okay.
Okay, so what we think now is that even like the gonads, the brain is bipotential, and if it encounters a male developmental pathway, it will get primed as a male brain, and if they encounter a female developmental pathway, it will be primed as a female brain. So it is exactly like what happens in the gonads. And then once the male and the female brain are developed, then you would now you will develop a cisgendered male and a cisgendered female if the gonads are taking a congruent decision. I hope this has become clear now.
Yeah. So one thing which is very interesting there is you said those are not part of the sex chromosomes, but if the cell knows it's going to become a female or a male, and if it's a cis or rather congruent decision, then the brain matches what the sex organs are. Now, what happens if it doesn't match that? Like, so from what I understand, it's not just based on genetics, it's also based on the wiring of our brains and the proteins expressed in our brains.
Yes. So what happens is that the genes which are there, they get translated and they get transcribed into RNA, and the proteins are made. And these proteins now wire our thing. So the color of the eye, the color of our skin, the texture of our skin, the shape of our hair, the color of our hair are all due to different amounts of proteins in these individuals. Okay, now the belief is that in almost most of the individuals, the way the gonad is taking a decision in either direction, the brain also takes a decision in the same direction. But it is possible, there is no reason for us to believe that in all the cases the decision has to be congruent.
So that's
Imagine if the
where
decision
different
is
sexuality
not.
arises.
Absolutely. I'll explain you with the help of a slide. Let's have a look at it again. So this is what in a normal individual it is expected to. The gonad and the brain has taken the same decision. So you could have the male cisgendered and would be straight. You could have a female cisgendered and also would be straight. But imagine a situation where an alternate decision is taken. The gonads have become testis, but the brain has become female. It has taken a female developmental pathway. Then the person is born with a male genitalia, but by the brain thinks it is a female. So you would have something what we used to call it as male, transgendered, could be straight, could not be straight. Conversely, on the other end of the spectrum, you could have a female genitalia, but the brain is primed to take the male developmental pathway. It is a male-like brain, and you could have now a female who is transgender, could be straight, could not be straight. Now imagine here the whole brain has taken such a kind of a decision. But remember, brain is made up of several compartments. The brain has what we call it as sex centers. Now imagine if this difference is occurring only in the sex centers of the brain, not in the rest of the parts of the brain. And then what you would get, that a person would be born with male genitalia. Several parts of the brain have taken a decision of male gender, male sex, whereas other parts of the brain have taken of that of a female sex. So now you would get something called as a gay, and conversely you would have a female cisgendered lesbian. So you can imagine different parts of the brains more likely can take different kinds of decisions, and now you can have the entire spectrum of what we would call it as the LGBTQ spectrum, where you could have somebody who is cisgendered and straight, to somebody who is transgender, to somebody who is cisgendered with an alternate sexual preference. So I hope this is making clear now that how genetics also can play a role in this entire developmental process.
Now that concludes the first part of the interview. In the second part, which comes out next week, we go into much detail about the proteins, the genetics, and also the brain chemistry, which is touched upon in this episode. Now, the reason I didn't go much into detail in this episode is because we wanted to ensure that we get a holistic view or an idea that sexuality, no matter what form it is completely natural. Now, that was the main concept of this episode, and we also wanted to make sure that people understood that there's nothing awkward about it, or there shouldn't be anything awkward about it. Now, while I do again encourage you guys to go and talk to your elders about sexuality for funny comments, but I also want to make sure you guys understand that it's completely natural. There shouldn't be anything awkward, or there should not be anything wrong about it. You should be able to talk about your sexuality because that's who you are. So with that, I'd like to conclude this episode, and I really hope you liked it. And please do stay tuned for next week's episode. Meanwhile, do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much.